Welcome to the third video in the training series about faculty meetings. The previous two videos provided elucidation on the fundamental theories and cutting-edge approaches to faculty meetings, as well as shed light on the first core content, which is unpacking the curriculum. As can be seen from the model on the slide, curriculum, instruction, and assessment are inextricably linked. When these three components are aligned, effective teaching will be facilitated. Therefore, ensuring such an alignment should be central to the professional practices. In parallel with the curriculum unpacking, discussions on instructional elements and assessments should be the next focal points to be placed in the agenda of faculty meetings. In this video, we will continue with the second core content of faculty meetings, which is instructional materials, methods, and practices. Upon the completion of this training, you will be able to define the core concepts, which are instructional materials, instructional methods, and instructional practices, explain the importance of discussing instructional materials, methods, and practices in faculty meetings, and articulate the requirements of discussions on instructional materials, methods, and practices in faculty meetings. Corresponding to the stated objectives, the training video will be divided into three main parts. Part 1, definitions of core concepts. Part 2, importance of instructional focuses in faculty meetings. And Part 3, requirements of discussions on instructional materials, methods, and practices. Now, we will come to the first part about the definitions of the core concepts included in the training video. The three key concepts to be explained in this video are instructional materials, instructional methods, and instructional practices. First of all, let's explore the concept of instructional materials. There are a variety of definitions for instructional materials. In the words of Richard and Schmidt in their study in 2002, the term materials may mean anything which can be used to facilitate teaching and learning. According to Omoini, instructional materials are information-carrying technologies that are used for instruction purposes with the hope of delivering educational information very quickly and widely. Faze and Dahan defined instructional materials as print and non-print items that are designed to impact information to students in the educational process. In other words, any resource that provides the information learners need to achieve the stated learning outcomes can be referred to as instructional materials. Agon also emphasized that instructional materials must be designed specifically to fulfill objectives in a teaching-learning situation. And Abimbade asserted it was necessary that materials to be referred to as instructional ones bring about effective teaching and learning. Some examples of various instructional materials are textbooks, videos, slide decks, websites, appropriate chalkboard, mathematics kits, science kits, a teaching guide, audiovisual aids, overhead projectors, electronic media, and so forth. In his study, Adeogun reveals a strong positive link between instructional resources and academic performance. He contends that schools that possess more instructional resources perform better than schools that have less instructional resources. Similarly, Farambi opines that the availability, adequacy, and relevance of instructional materials in classrooms can influence quality teaching, which can have a positive effect on students' learning and academic performance. Miria comments in the same vein, adding that students' performance is affected by the quality and quantity of teaching and learning resources. The use of appropriate instructional materials to supplement teaching will enhance learners' innovative and creative thinking, as well as help them become believable, spontaneous, and eager in any lesson, said Murtala Saleh in his study in 2016. It is evident that instructional materials are of paramount importance in classroom interaction and successful transfer of knowledge from the teacher to the learners. Specifically, some important roles that instructional material play in the teaching-learning processes include transmitting information, ideas, and notes to learners, enhancing the memory level of the students, facilitating the teaching-learning process, improving student rate of accumulation, assisting in giving a sense of reality to the body of knowledge under discussions, encouraging teachers' creativity, and permitting the students and teachers to experience in concrete terms the learning activities that can promote the idea of self-evaluation. Next, we will look at several definitions of the three core concepts that govern all teaching activities: approach, method, and practice. First, let's talk about the relationship between teaching approach and teaching method. Approach, as it is normally understood, refers to a set of principles, beliefs, or ideas about the nature of learning which is taken by teachers, then translated into the classroom in the forms of actual methods and practices. It is more of a mindset or a guiding principle than anything concrete that can be applied in the classroom. How we approach teaching in a certain subject will then inform our selection of teaching methods, just as the methods we employ reflect our teaching approach. For example, an ESL teacher with a more teacher-centered approach will prefer using the grammar translation method, while a teacher following a more communicative approach will gravitate more towards task-based teaching. Of course, this is not a hard and fast rule, but rather a roughly relationship between our general belief about teaching and what we actually do in order to teach effectively. Now, we will examine several different definitions of instructional methods. In his book, Instructional Process and Concepts in Theory and Practice, Salal Akdeniz defines instructional methods as a course of activities that teachers implement to help learners to achieve their objectives at the earliest and in the shortest way. We can see from this definition that instructional methods should be concerned with improving the efficiency of the learning process. This definition is further expanded by Peter Westbrook in the book What Teachers Need to Know About Teaching Methods. He posits that teaching methods consist of decisions made about teaching while taking into account not only the nature of the subject, but also how students learn. Taken together with the previous definition, we can roughly define teaching methods as a system of activities and decision-making that is informed by the particular characteristics of our students and what we would like them to achieve. In the context of standards-based teaching, this should be understood as contributing towards students achieving desired standard competencies. Now, let's move to the concept of instructional practices. This is a very broad concept, and many government bodies like the New York City Department of Education define it as every teaching-related activity, including planning and preparation, non-instructional classroom interactions, instruction, and responsibilities outside the classroom. However, in the scope of this training video, we will examine several narrower and more specific definitions of teaching practices. I. Jingtae and Salmiza Saleh of the University Sains Malaysia define the concept as the consistent actions, behaviors, and attitudes taken by teachers in developing the lesson in the classroom. The key word here is consistent, as it implies that these actions, behaviors, and attitudes are carried across multiple lessons and are adopted regardless of the subject matter being delivered. Expanding on this concept, Robert O. Williams of Indiana State University believes that practices are behaviors chiefly influenced by teachers' particular beliefs about the purpose of schooling, the process of learning, the learner, and the teacher's own style. Thus, we can see that while methods primarily refer to systematic actions or series of decisions aimed at maximizing learning outcomes, informed by learning outcomes and content, practices can be understood as the consistent attitude and behaviors that teachers exhibit in the actual teaching learning process. These are more often than not the result of teachers' personal experiences, personalities, and beliefs. Developing suitable instructional methods and effective instructional practices can tremendously help teachers maximize their students' learning results and provide them with the tools and environment they need to achieve the required standards. In the context of this video, we will discuss two different applications of the concept of instructional practices: the practical application of theories and concepts during the actual process of teaching and learning, and the broader understanding, habits, behaviors, and mindset that we can develop to enhance the process of teaching and learning. We have gone through the definitions of the three key concepts, and now we are moving to their importance. Why is it necessary to make instructional materials, methods, and practices become prioritized topics in faculty meetings? The model on the slide summarizes the benefits that discussions related to instructional elements will bring to managers and teachers in particular, and to the faculty and the school in general. For managers, it is the process where they lead, support, and monitor the faculty to strengthen sustainable practices and systems for effective curriculum implementation. For teachers, such discussions increase their confidence and readiness for real teaching. Thought-provoking questions during discussions trigger their critical thinking, make them ponder, and lead to their changes, not only through theoretical research, but by doing and reflecting. At the macro level, the discussion of teaching materials, methods, and practices will promote collaboration, alignment, shared responsibility, and especially practicality of faculty meetings. Barnett, in one study in 2004, indicated that the teachers prefer meetings that are short and straight to the point, with practical information and ideas that they can take to their classrooms. Additionally, they are interested in more practice and less theory, having implementation of techniques modeled successfully, and having time to share ideas and materials. All of this together will help the faculty and the school achieve the ultimate goal, which is educational growth, as stated in the first training video about the overview of faculty meetings, arming teachers with the knowledge, skills, and tools needed to enable effective implementation. As we stated earlier, this training video aims at providing general requirements and guidance for discussion on instructional materials, methods, and practices in faculty meetings. These three concepts discussed in this training video will be analyzed at three different stages: pre-class, during class, and post-class. There are some important notices when instructional issues are selected as topics for discussion in faculty meeting. First, each faculty meeting can deal with one, two, or all instructional foci. Second, one instructional subject matter is usually related to more than just one instructional focus. Third, these three instructional foci are intrinsically intertwined. Fourth, based on the moment the faculty meeting is convened, the agenda will be determined accordingly as to what essential questions need to be answered. Fifth, all three stages, pre, during, and post, are not necessarily executed for each and every lesson or period. Realities and priorities call the shot. And finally, essential questions and recommended notes can be applied both during faculty meetings or by individuals for personal professional development purposes. When considering the three key concepts before teaching implementation, the essential question to be raised for discussion in faculty meetings is how to select instructional materials, methods, and practices that are suitable for the determined learning outcomes. For each concept, we will go in depth in two respects: factors for consideration and thought-provoking requirements. Let's start with pre-class evaluation of instructional materials. In an article published in 2016 in the International Journal of Humanities and Management Science, Saleh stated that learning is a process through which knowledge, skills, habits, facts, ideas, and principles are acquired, retained, and utilized. And hardly any teaching and learning could happen in the absence of instructional materials. And no teachers with the hope of promoting learning could ignore the use of instructional materials in their teaching. When effective and adequate usage of instructional materials are guaranteed, success in learning will be facilitated. As one of teachers' strategic factors in organizing and providing education, instructional materials must be carefully selected through a rigorous evaluation process, which take place periodically and at different times of the school year. In the first stage of material evaluation, called pre-class or pre-use evaluation, it involves making predictions about the potential value of materials on people who use them. This is cited from Tomlinson, 1998 and 2003. Tomlinson indicates that this type of evaluation is often impressionistic, subjective, and unreliable, since the teacher scans a book quickly to gain an impression about its value. However, this type of evaluation is very important in the process of material selection. Ellis, 1997, and Mukandan, 2009, indicate that predictive evaluation is carried out to determine if the materials are adequate and suitable for use. So, what steps and what criteria should the faculty follow in the pre-use evaluation process? At the beginning of the school year, the school board and the faculty need to review and prepare resources that meet the requirements of the program implementation. It should be noted that, at this time, the review is to ensure the preparation of the most basic and essential resources, which are the minimum requirements. The school board and the faculty, based on the scheme of work, decide which resources need to be prepared and must ensure that all resources have been adequately prepared and reasonably allocated to each unit and each lesson before the new school year starts. When compiling a resource list, the necessity and effectiveness of the resource is central to our pre-selection consideration. If any material has been used since the previous school year, its effectiveness must be evaluated to identify areas for adjustment and amendment. In subjects whose curriculum has been systematized on the mapping portal, though useful resources have been recommended already, the decision on what to be selected and used must be made and agreed by all the faculty members. They should discuss to identify what resource is critical to the program implementation, what is suitable to their teaching contexts, what can be omitted, what should be supplemented, whether there are enough resources to allocate among teachers and classes, and how to allocate them, etc. Once a resource directory is in place, it will then need to be decided which items should be prepared by the school and which should be prepared by teachers and students. If there are deficiencies or redundancies in resources during the curriculum implementation, it is the responsibility of the campus to respond to actual needs in a timely manner. In this case, it is unreasonable if the campus's administrators rigidly and inflexibly adhere to the curriculum framework as a kind of directive and refuse their accountability for the actual teaching and learning activities. The school board, department heads, and teaching staff themselves need to proactively identify problems and offer appropriate suggestions and solutions. During the school year, before each unit and each lesson, the faculty should again review and list all instructional materials that are to be used and discuss how to best utilize them in the most optimal way. It is very important for us to apply multidirectional thinking to this process. First of all, we should design backwards from learning outcomes. Teachers and the faculty need to build on those learning outcomes to make choices in the design of the activity and the resources needed to implement the activity effectively. After this step, the teacher needs to develop another thought process in the opposite direction and consider whether the selected resources effectively support the implementation of activities that help achieve the learning goals. In summary, during the school year, when discussing instructional materials, the essential question is, how can resources become an effective tool for students to achieve unit outcomes and lesson objectives? At the same time, the selected instructional materials need to be the most optimal solution, capable of serving as many students as possible. If in the instructional materials list there are two options that serve the same lesson objective, and the presence of one makes it unnecessary to use the other, this means that these materials have either not been effectively utilized or not really helped students achieve the lesson objectives in the most optimal way. In addition, discussions about instructional materials in faculty meetings should encourage teachers to use resources that help achieve multiple learning goals simultaneously. For example, the table of 100 is utilized in our primary math program to allow students to practice multiple skills. For example, students can use this resource to learn how to read, write, and repeat numbers within 100, count forward and backward by 1 unit, count forward and backward by 10 units, recognize odd and even numbers, and etc. It is not the intention of this training video to lay out any hard and fast rule about the degree upon which instructional materials need to be utilized in order to help students achieve their learning goals. Instead, we only give some examples and questions for teachers to think about. The first example in geography, when using an atlas, besides helping students achieve goals related to content knowledge, what measures can teachers take to simultaneously help students develop their social sciences research skills? Or in history, when using textbooks, besides gaining content knowledge, developing summarizing skills, and analyzing arguments, can teachers integrate the goal of improving the ability to discern the facts from opinions by asking questions beyond the textbook? The next reminder is the fact that instructional materials should serve a wide diversity of students. At the beginning of the year, discussions related to resource selection should be mainly representative and common to the whole class or stage. But during the school year, when the teacher has gained a certain degree of understanding of the student population, materials-related decisions need to consider the degree of suitability of materials employed for the particular students in the class. For example, in ESL, a resource catalog is available on the CX, but this is representative of the entire stage. In actual implementation, some schools will have students sitting in stage 1 whose ability is on a much lower level, which means teachers need to make decisions and add materials to support these types of students. We should also prioritize the materials that can help both students who are in the correct stages as well as those who might struggle to achieve the proficiency required in the stage they are in. Last but not least, instructional materials selected must be safe to use and budget-friendly. Undoubtedly, it is impossible to ignore safety criteria in selecting materials when a safe learning environment is always our top priority. In addition, cost optimization will help the operation become more efficient because savings from cost-cutting can be allocated into areas which require growth, investment, or innovation. We have talked now about some requirements in the selection of materials before teaching. In the next section, we will explore some of the criteria for assessing the quality and relevance of instructional materials. According to Ololobu, Jacob, and Dejaga from 1999, some of the things that teachers must consider before selecting instructional materials include consideration for the age and abilities of the learner. It is very important for the teacher to put into consideration the age and abilities of his or her students. If the instructional materials chosen and used are above or below students' level and inappropriate for their age, it can inhibit learning rather than promoting effective learning. Instructional materials must be related to the lesson objectives. Any instructional material that is not geared towards helping in the achievement of the lesson objectives is not worthy to be used in the lesson. Currency of information. Any instructional materials that are worthy of use in the classroom must be current. Another table of criteria for determining the quality of instructional materials can be found in one WestEd article published in March 2017 with 4 main groups of criteria. Group 1 is about accuracy and visual appeal. Group 2 presents the alignment to standards and depth of knowledge. Group 3 discusses ease of use and availability of support, and Group 4 shows the sub-criteria about engagement and ability to meet student needs. The details can be read in the table on the slide. As can be seen, criteria for the selection of suitable instructional materials are legion. In the context of VinSchool, it is recommended that the following criteria be prioritized. Accuracy, no errors, correct information, and well-written. Alignment, aligned to the stated learning outcomes, unit outcomes, or lesson objectives. As standards-based education is one of the wigs of the school year, the alignment between instructional materials and the learning outcomes should be the focus when instructional materials are brought to the discussion. Aligning materials with objectives means that the learning materials should be chosen specifically and primarily to help students achieve the objectives in the most direct way possible. Beginning with determining the learning outcomes, teachers then pick instructional materials that will make the pathway to mastering those objectives as straight and continuous as possible for the students. Appropriateness, appropriate to the level of the course, age appropriateness, appropriate to students' background, knowledge, culture, experience, etc., and appropriate to students' needs. There's a subtle detail in this. Materials that meet the above criteria about appropriateness are more likely to boost learner engagement than those that do not. And finally, we have appeal and ease of use. Physically appealing, easy to use and follow, and have sufficient support for teachers, teacher's guide, manual, instructions, assessment package, photocopyable materials, and answers. Next, we will talk about employing the selected methods in actual teaching activities. As we have discussed earlier, the three core concepts of approach, method, and practice governs almost all teaching activities, and thus discussions surrounding these three concepts will happen during faculty meetings throughout the school year. First and most importantly, at the beginning of the school year, we need to ensure that all teachers in the faculty have a consistent understanding of the specific approaches to the subject. This might sound obvious, especially considering the fact that in some subjects the CX does have this conveniently laid out, and for others, the recommended approach for the subject can be found in most academic sources. However, each teacher, with his or her own personal experience, would have a different interpretation of what an approach entails when put in the context of achieving specific standard competencies and delivering specific content knowledge. So the same approach might look very different in two different teachers' classrooms. This is the reason why every discussion about approach needs to start with the teachers of the faculty sharing their views and understanding of their subject-specific approaches during the faculty meeting. This will allow the faculty to discuss and align all teachers' different ways of understanding the approach with one another's, thus ensuring the faculty as a whole implements a specific approach in the most practical manner to help students achieve the specific competencies laid out in the standard. If you recall our previous training video on unpacking the curriculum, this process was discussed as an essential part of gaining sufficient insight into the curriculum, which will in turn allow teachers to more effectively deliver these lessons. This process is not a one-time process either. During the school year, it needs to be repeated in the faculty meeting for every unit to ensure that the faculty is always under the same alignment with regard to the specific approach teachers will take to achieve each unit outcome and each lesson objective. When discussing what to do for each unit, we will need to apply this process of alignment to determine which specific instructional method to take in order to achieve our learning outcome. This is because it is always beneficial to encourage teachers to share which method they think would be most suitable within the agreed upon approach, which will allow the faculty as a whole to create a list of methods and activities based on which teachers can discuss and select the most suitable and practical ones to help students achieve the desired outcomes. We hope that this procedure has sufficiently outlined how important it is for teachers to collaborate with their colleagues while orienting themselves and planning which method to use in the classroom. Not only will this ensure consistency of instruction across the faculty, but it will allow all teachers to pool their knowledge and experiences to help each other optimize their students' learning outcomes. But how exactly do we choose an instructional method? And how do we decide if a method is good or bad for our particular needs? In his book, Teaching from Command to Discovery, Muscab Mastoon theorized that choosing a teaching method is essentially a series of decisions made on the kind of knowledge or skill students need to learn. How deep will the learning content be covered? How much time to devote to each portion of the lesson? Where the lesson is to take place? How the class will be managed? What kind of communication will occur? And most importantly, how many of these decisions does the teacher need to make, and how many can be left to the students? Mastoon's model breaks teaching down into its constituent components, and he was chiefly concerned with carefully considering and optimizing each of these components, as well as determining how much agency and empowerment can be given to the students. In 2012, Maylin Cochran-Smith of Boston University, along with other researchers, laid out another set of criteria to evaluate teaching methods. According to this research, good teaching methods need to be suitable for a diverse set of students, be differentiable for students of different abilities, be engaging for both the teacher and the students, be informed by data collected from assessment, effectively employ resources, and be the result of professional collaboration. The above sets of criteria, though both informative and comprehensive, might be too much for the busy practicing teacher. With a view of developing standard-based learning, we have condensed these considerations into three main factors that should be chiefly considered when discussing instructional methods in faculty meetings. First and foremost, the ultimate objective of choosing a teaching method must always be to optimize the process of students achieving the required standards. Thus, any discussion and efforts to improve teaching methods have to be centered around how the method will help students move closer toward achieving their standards. Centering all discussions around the goal of developing standards competency will also allow us to avoid the pitfall of valuing student experience over actual learning. Modern teaching theories often emphasize factors like students having fun, student engagement, or student motivation, and many teachers would erroneously think that these factors are the goal of their lessons, leading to lessons that, while fun and enjoyable for the students, are less than optimal in achieving the end goal of achieving desired standards. During faculty meetings, we need to constantly remind our colleagues and ourselves that these factors, while tremendously important, are ultimately subservient to the final goal of helping students achieve their standards, and thus we cannot allow them to take over our lessons. For example, many students enjoy watching movies in ESL classes, but if these movie watching sessions are not followed up by activities that allow students to develop the movie experience into certain standard competencies, then the lesson time has not been the most effectively utilized. Similarly, while online quizzing platforms like Quizzes or Kahoot can be very engaging and motivating, spending an excessive amount of class time on them could have detrimental effects on moving students toward their final objectives. Furthermore, we have to ensure that there is a certain amount of diversity and consistency in the teaching method employed by different teachers in the faculty. As a matter of course, different teachers will have different preferences, familiarity, and affinity with one method or another, and we all have a trove of key instructional techniques that we rely upon. However, if each of us relies on only a limited number of key teaching methods, our lessons may not meet the needs of all students or may become boring. On another level, if the teachers in the faculty use too many different methods, it will be difficult for the school system managers to ensure uniformity in learning experience and quality of all students. Thus, the process of sharing and discussing different methods during faculty meetings can tremendously help teachers identify the most suitable and practical method to allow our students to achieve desired standards in the most efficient manner. So it would be beneficial for all teachers in the faculty to try to adopt such methods to maximize learning effectiveness. This will also allow teachers to widen their repertoire of teaching techniques, thus enhancing their professional capabilities. Lastly, we also need to make certain that the instructional method we choose is suitable for our particular group of students. Not only does each student have a different learning style and respond differently to teaching activities, each group of students, and more specifically, each class within a school, also collectively create a different learning atmosphere. And a method that works for one group might not necessarily achieve the same level of effectiveness with another. Thus, when discussing methods during faculty meetings, we also have to think about whether or not they are the best one to apply to our particular group of students, and if it isn't, get opinions from our colleagues on how to adjust it. The last component of actual teaching we will look at is instructional practices. As stated above, the term instructional practice itself has some very broad definitions that encompass all aspects of teaching, including planning, materials, teaching, and assessment. However, in the scope of this training video, we will limit this definition to that of the specific strategies and techniques employed in an actual teaching. During the pre-class stage, this mostly consists of planning the specific learning activities that will take place in the classroom. Once again, we would like to emphasize that which activity is implemented in teaching is greatly informed by the method chosen by teachers, so it is extremely important that we allocate time during faculty meetings to ensure that the methods to be employed have been carefully considered for the impact they will have on student outcome. Once this has been achieved, teachers can then proceed to choose the activities that reflect the methods that we have chosen, are optimized to help students achieve their learning outcomes, and are engaging for the students. To help simplify this process, we would like to introduce the where-to model, proposed by Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe in their landmark work, Understanding by Design. This model outlines the considerations and decisions that teachers need to make when designing learning activities. First, we need to make sure our students understand where they are going and why they are going there. In standards-based teaching, this essentially means clear elaboration and explanation of the different standards to students so that they understand the value of what they are learning. This will also serve to improve student motivation, which we'll discuss in more detail in a later section of this video. Second, we need to hook and hold our students' interest. It is very important that our activities attract students and sustain their engagement throughout the lessons, so as to ensure students can gain the most of what we have prepared for them. Third, we need to ensure that we enable and equip our students to explore and experience. Our activities need to be designed and sequenced in such a way that they provide students with all the capabilities needed to navigate the learning content and make their own discoveries. Fourth, we need to ensure our students will reflect, think, and revise. Learning is not a linear process, but more of a spiral loop, and thus it is essential that students are encouraged and trained in the habit of constantly looking back and revisiting what they have learned in order to reinforce their own capabilities. Fifth, we need to provide students with the opportunity to evaluate their own process and also that of their peers. Sixth, we need to tailor and personalize the activities to our students. As discussed above, no two students are the same and no two groups of students are the same, so it is our job as teachers to ensure that, to the best of our abilities, our activities are designed to address not only the differences in student levels, but also in personality and family background to maximize the effectiveness of their learning. Finally, we have to ensure that our activities are organized and sequenced logically to allow students to move from passive receiver of information to active and independent pursuer of knowledge and competency. We have finished with the first stage, which happens before class. Moving on to the next stage, during class, the essential question which leads the discussion is how to employ instructional materials, methods, and practices to facilitate the achievement of learning outcomes effectively. At this stage, the general requirements are focus on the achievement of outcomes, emphasize the adaptability to actual teaching situations, and consider differentiation and personalization to accommodate students' levels, needs, interests, and personalities. Again, we are going to look at the three concepts one by one, starting with instructional materials. During class or whilst use evaluation of instructional materials involves measuring the value of materials while using them or while observing them being used. Whilst use evaluation could be more objective and reliable than pre-use evaluation as it makes use of measurement rather than prediction. Tomlinson maintains that it observes the performance of learners on exercises. However, it cannot measure durable and effective learning because of the delayed effect of instruction. In a research conducted by a group of researchers from Yazd University in 2021, they proposed a list of criteria to take into account while conducting a whilst use evaluation: clarity of instructions, clarity of layout, comprehensibility of texts, credibility of tasks, achievability of tasks, achievement of performance objectives, potential for localization, practicality of the materials, teachability of the materials, flexibility of the materials, appeal of the materials, motivating power of the materials, impact of the materials, and effectiveness in facilitating short-term learning. Tomlinson argues that most of the whilst use evaluation aspects could be assessed impressionistically through observation, though he advises that it would be preferable to focus on one aspect per observation. In other words, greater reliability can be achieved by focusing on one criterion at a time and also by using pre-prepared instruments of measurement, such as a checklist of criteria. According to Tomlinson, making use of a checklist of criteria has become popular in materials evaluation, and certain checklists from the literature have been frequently made use of in evaluations. The problem, as recognized by Bird, is that no criteria can be applicable to all situations, and it is also important that there be a congruence between the materials and the curriculum, students, and teachers. Some other researchers, like Matthews, Cunningsworth, and Tomlinson, also stress the importance of relating evaluation criteria to what is known about the context of learning, meaning the criteria should be consonant with the context of learning. So practitioners can probably come up with a certain set of evaluation criteria. Now we will discuss what is going to happen during actual teaching. In this section, we will no longer make the distinction between method and practice, because as has been stated in the definition of instructional practice above, this concept encompasses every single action, behavior, and attitude carried out by the teacher in class. Here, we will focus on talking about things that teachers can observe, adjust, and improve during their lessons. No matter how carefully we plan our lesson, there will always be times when things don't go as planned. Furthermore, even if things don't go as planned, we should still be constantly looking out for teaching opportunities or other things that we can do in our lessons that will allow our students to maximize their learning. We shall now take a look at a few of these factors that can elevate our lessons, as well as analyze some actual classroom situations to understand what could go wrong when these factors are overlooked and how we can move and adapt to problems when they occur. The three factors that we will look at are essential considerations in standards-based teaching because they ensure that our lessons operate in the most efficient way possible while keeping the goal of allowing students to progress toward reaching their required standards. These three factors are maximizing students' motivation, establishing a mastery goal structure, and adjusting teaching strategies based on formative assessment. The first thing we should do in class is to ensure that our students are as motivated as possible. Professor Zoltan Dornier of the University of Nottingham posits that students are motivated to complete a task if they value the task outcome and expect to do well on it. Thus, we should constantly observe every single student to ensure that they understand the importance of the LO they are aiming at and receive the proper support that allow them to effectively tackle the task. Here, it would be beneficial for us to look back at the second video and emphasize again the importance of unpacking and thoroughly understanding the objectives of each unit and each lesson in order to be able to clearly communicate to students not only what they're supposed to learn during a lesson, but also what kind of abilities they'll be able to gain and how that will help them work towards achieving their standards. Let's take the flipped classroom method as an example. Theoretically, this method should be employed to increase student engagement and maximize the amount of time they spend doing activities in class. Students would be asked to do research only after their interest in the subject matter has been sparked and provided with the proper tool for obtaining content knowledge, like a specific reading list or the researching skills needed in order for the students to effectively complete their learning activities. However, many teachers, especially those teaching content-heavy subjects like history or geography, abuse this method and turn most of their lessons into go home, research this, then report sessions. Most of the time, students wouldn't care about the subject matter, and on top of that, are not provided with the proper skills and tools to conduct research, creating substandard outcomes that improve neither their knowledge nor their skill set, which in turn decreases both their interest in the subject and their motivation to do well in it. Another important factor that can promote standards-based learning is setting up and maintaining a mastery goal structure. Please note that in the context of this discussion, goals are not something teachers give students, but an internalized sense of purpose that students construct themselves. Academic research into student motivation has identified two broad types of goal structures. Performance goals refer to goals of demonstrating competence or avoiding the demonstration of a lack of competence. And mastery goals refer to the goals of improving understanding and abilities or avoiding demonstrating a lack of improvement. Let's take a simple history classroom as an example. In this class, a student with performance goals orientation will be primarily concerned with getting high grades or with avoiding the undesirable grades, while one with mastery goals orientation would want to improve his or her understanding of a particular period or to ensure that the teacher thinks his or her understanding has actually improved. Multiple research has demonstrated that both goals of avoiding demonstrating a lack of competence and goals of avoiding demonstrating a lack of improvement are associated with negative, maladaptive outcomes, including self handicapping, learned helplessness, disengagement, and cheating. On the other hand, goals of improving understanding and abilities are associated with adaptive academic outcomes, including help seeking, deep strategy use, and persistence. Lastly, there is mixed evidence regarding the outcomes of goals of demonstrating competence, suggesting that these goals can be helpful for some students in some contexts, like preparing for a high stakes standardized test. Obviously, in a standards based learning environment, the ultimate goal is for students to demonstrate competence in order for teachers to evaluate whether or not students have achieved a certain standard. However, in working toward these standards, it is tremendously more beneficial to align our goal structure more towards mastery in order to motivate students in striving to achieve standards. Now, we will look at how to actually establish a goal structure that can facilitate a mastery goal orientation in our students. Goal structure is defined by Carol Ames of the University of Illinois as teacher practices that send a message to students about the purpose of learning, and mastery classroom goal structures communicate to students that the goal is to improve competence and master skills. This is often conveyed not just through formal lesson objectives and assessment schemes, but also through the instructional practices students experience, the messages they hear from teachers, students' perceptions of their teachers' beliefs, and whether the students' perceptions of teachers' beliefs and teachers' own beliefs are aligned. Additionally, teachers' approaches to tasks, authority, recognition, grouping, evaluation, and the use of time can communicate an emphasis on either mastery or performance goals. In essence, everything a teacher does in the classroom can help reinforce in students the idea that although their ultimate goal is to achieve and demonstrate standards competency, they can get there much more easily by adopting an adaptive mindset of perseverance, hard work, challenge seeking, and not being afraid of failure. Research conducted by Helen Patricks of Purdue University demonstrated that teachers perceived as promoting mastery goal structure tend to exhibit the following teaching practices. First, teachers should plan for full and equitable participation in learning activities, acknowledging students' differences in personalities, learning styles, cognitive abilities, and personal experiences, instead of just focusing on students with better performances. This will allow students to feel that their work is appreciated by their teachers no matter how low their level is. Secondly, teachers should emphasize efforts instead of performance when giving students feedback on how well students have done. This will prevent weaker students from having an inferiority complex when comparing themselves with stronger ones, while on the other hand, discouraging stronger students from being complacent and pushing them to constantly strive to improve themselves. We can infer from this that even when preparing students for a high-stake exam like the IGCSE or the A-level, teachers still shouldn't focus too much on just the content of the exam and how well the student will do in terms of absolute results, but instead on how to help students master the standards that the exam aims to evaluate and the competencies that students will be able to master during the course of preparing for this exam. Lastly, teachers should encourage students to interact with each other during activities instead of just setting out tasks for individual students to complete. This will create a positive and supportive classroom environment where students help and seek help from each other instead of competing to see who finishes the task faster and has better results. Aside from the above factors, we would also like to introduce research from Melissa Carolina Gilbert from the University of Michigan and her colleagues. This study suggests that students who perceived that their teacher believed that they were capable of learning were more likely to adopt mastery goal orientations. In contrast, students who perceived that their teacher did not believe they were capable of understanding were more likely to adopt performance goal orientations. Therefore, students' perceptions of their teachers' practices, statements, and beliefs shaped their interpretation of classroom goal structures, which means that aside from having activities and practices that align more clearly with mastering goal structures, we should pay attention to how they communicate with the students to ensure that our students are confident in the fact that their teachers believe in their potential to improve and achieve their standards, and that their teachers appreciate the efforts they put into studying. Now, let's look at a specific example of a teaching practice that can help encourage our students to develop a mastery goals orientation. A common issue that has been observed in many classrooms is the fact that there is a lack of communication and clarification of the lesson objectives between the teacher and the students. Often, the teacher would just copy lesson objectives from the curriculum map on a corner of the board or read them out loud from the slides without doing any further elaboration for the students. This is detrimental for student learning because the curriculum map is designed to be a technical document, which means that while it provides very clear direction for teachers as to what to achieve in the classroom, its language might not always be suitable for student understanding. Thus, in order to truly communicate to students what they are expected to achieve during the lesson, teachers should rephrase lesson objectives to ensure that their language is at a level understandable for all students. Take some time in the beginning of each lesson to explain and unpack the lesson objectives. And lastly, develop content checking questions to assure that all students are at the very least aware of what they are supposed to achieve. The obvious benefit of this practice is the fact that it will enhance the students' understanding of what they are supposed to achieve, thus helping to increase their motivation as we have discussed earlier. More importantly, it can help teachers communicate that they in fact care about moving students further along in achieving their required standards, thus helping to steer students towards more of a mastery goal orientation. Lastly, we would like to highlight the importance of using formative assessment to inform and adjust our teaching. When the main goal of teaching is to facilitate the achievement of certain standards, it is impossible to rigidly follow a prescribed teaching plan and hope to achieve consistent results with all students. Once again, we would like to emphasize that no two students are the same, and no two groups of students are the same, and thus it is reasonable to assume that different students will move towards the standard at different rates. Over time, this means that the optimal instructional practice for different groups of students will need to be substantially differentiated in order for us to ensure that all students move toward their standard at an optimal rate. And this adjustment needs to be informed by the data obtained by frequent formative assessments. In essence, only by understanding where our students are at any given stage of instruction can we make the required adjustments to our teaching methods and practices that will allow all students to achieve the required standards. We will go a lot more in depth about formative assessments in a subsequent training video in this series, and for now, we will mainly discuss the effect it has on teaching practices. To formalize this process, we would like to introduce a model developed in the early 1970s by Benjamin Bloom, who is arguably the most influential figure in the development of standards-based learning. In this model, Bloom outlined the three main principal practices for what he termed mastery learning, a term which would later evolve into standards-based learning. First, teachers must be explicit in their understanding of what skills and knowledge constitute mastery of particular course material. Next, students should be given frequent formative assessments to determine whether they have mastered particular course content. Finally, based on this outcome, there are two possible courses of action. Students who have not achieved mastery should be given both specific correctives, such as alternative resources for learning the material or additional practice, and time to learn the material before completing a second formative evaluation over the same course content. This process should be repeated until the students have mastered the course content. Students who achieve mastery the first time and do not need to complete correctives should instead be given enrichment activities that go beyond the basic coursework. This process should be repeated until all students have successfully mastered all course content. In short, in faculty meetings, teachers should be encouraged to share their observations of what is going on in their classrooms as well as their methods for assessing where students are in working towards standards so that the entire faculty can ensure that all students are given the appropriate support necessary to ensure they are on track to meet standards. Using formative assessment to truly inform our teaching and improve our teaching decisions is a matter easier said than done. As a matter of fact, many teachers do employ the excellent practice of giving students a short quiz after the content section of their lesson to check how much of the content their students have been able to grasp. And oftentimes, students are even allowed to mark their peers' answers, which makes this activity a great tool for checking as well as for supporting learning. However, few teachers actually utilize the results they get from this kind of quiz to guide their next actions, which severely undermines its usefulness as a formative assessment tool. Ideally, this kind of assessment should be used so that teachers can properly differentiate follow-up activities and lessons, where the students who score lower should be given more reinforcement type of activities, so they can improve the degree in which they have mastered the material, while those who score high, thus demonstrating mastery, should be given more challenging activities in order to deepen and enrich their understanding. Now, we are moving up to the final stage, which is post-class. The essential question of this stage is how to adjust and improve instructional materials, methods, and practices to support students to achieve learning outcomes more effectively. It should be noted that this stage is much of a retrospective process, which involves continuous reflection, adjustment, and improvement. At the post-class stage, if instructional materials are made the topic in a faculty meeting, what can the discussion be centered around? Post-class or post-use evaluation is probably the most valuable or informative type of evaluation because it can measure the actual effects of the materials on the users. Tomlinson maintained that post-use evaluation can measure 1. The short-term effects such as motivation, impact, achievability, instant learning, and so on, and 2. The long-term effects like durable learning and application. This category may be the most useful evaluations since it is conducted after the participants have had reasonable time using the materials. The users of the materials can then give clear and useful opinions and suggestions about the evaluated materials. This type of evaluation provides teachers with valid and reliable information that helps them to develop the target materials. Moreover, as stated in Cunningsworth research in 1995, this type of evaluation is helpful and useful for identifying the points of strength and weakness that emerge over a period of using the coursebooks. According to Michon and Timmis in their study in 2015, while pre-use evaluation has an important role in predicting poor selection of materials or selection of poor materials, post-use evaluation is potentially the most informative type. McGrath also believes that retrospective evaluation can lead to the identification of weaknesses in the materials, thereby leading to constructive revision and adaptation. To conclude, by conducting a post-use evaluation, one can 1. Measure the actual outcomes of the use of the materials, and 2. Provide the data in order to make reliable decisions about the use, adaptation, or replacement of the materials. In their study in 2021, Ferrangis and her team suggest that we should take into account the following while conducting a post-use evaluation. What do the learners know which they did not know before starting to use the materials? What do the learners still not know despite using the materials? What can the learners do which they could not do before starting to use the materials? What can the learners still not do despite using the materials? To what extent have the materials prepared the learners for their examinations? To what extent have the materials prepared the learners for their post-course use of the target knowledge? What effect have the materials had on the confidence of the learners? What effect have the materials had on the motivation of the learners? To what extent have the materials helped the learners to become independent learners? Did the teachers find the materials easy to use? Did the materials help the teachers to cover the syllabus? And did the teachers find the materials help them to standardize the teaching in their institution? McGrath suggests specific focuses on the role of the teacher in both whilst-use and post-use evaluations. He argues that teachers can ask themselves questions of the following kind as prompts for whilst-use and post-use evaluations. What proportion of the materials was I able to use unchanged? Did the unchanged materials appear to work well? And what evidence do I have for this? What spontaneous changes did I make as I taught with the materials? Did these improvisations work well? And if not, what do I need to do differently? McGrath also recommends that teachers should keep records of use, noting sections of the materials they had used or omitted, which sections went well, and so on. Lastly, we will discuss post-class evaluation and adjustment of methods and practices, which should naturally take up a large portion of all faculty meetings. Unlike evaluation of teaching materials, evaluation of teaching methods and practices needs to be carried out in a much more careful manner, since by doing so, we are essentially evaluating the teacher themselves. However, this process is absolutely essential. Multiple studies, such as one carried out by Helen Timperley of the University of Auckland, have established the strong impact that continuing teacher training and assessment can have on student outcomes. Such assessment can be carried out through multiple means, like teaching observation and feedback, personal reflection, leadership evaluation, documentation evaluation, student ratings, or evaluating student progress. But in the scope of this training video, we will only focus on the types of assessment and feedback outlined by the VinSchool Classroom Observation rubric, peer observation, manager observation, and teacher self-assessment and reflection. The first, and unarguably most important aspect that we need to keep in mind when discussing teaching performance during faculty meetings is actually the purpose of these discussions. In 1988, James Popham of UCLA identified two uses of measures of teacher effectiveness as fixing, which consists of formative assessment intended to improve practice, and firing, which consists of summative assessment with consequences attached, like docking pay or termination of employment. We have to realize that whenever discussions of teaching performance take place after a lesson among faculty members, it is very easy for the conversation to veer towards the summative mentality. However, in order for improvement in teaching quality to actually take place, the conversation needs to center not on placing blame, but on identifying areas of improvement. Indeed, Patricia H. Inchi of Penn State University asserts that assessment to improve practice requires that teachers be open to admitting weaknesses, which can only happen in a relatively non-threatening environment. Teachers whose work can be improved, but who are feeling at risk may understandably be inclined to hide rather than confront their problems, and in doing so, precluding valuable formative feedback. From this, we can clearly see that during faculty meetings, there needs to be clear communication that the purpose of the discussion is to help teachers improve, to make teachers feel non-threatened and receptive towards suggestions. Next, we will move on to the dimensions that should be observed and discussed regarding teaching performance. There are multiple established frameworks for evaluating teaching performance, and in this training video, we would like to introduce one of the most popular, which is employed by multiple education authorities in the U.S., including the New York City Department of Education, Charlotte Danielson's Framework for Teaching. This framework evaluates teacher performance according to 4 domains: planning and preparation, the classroom environment, instruction, and professional responsibilities. But in the limited scope of this video, we will only introduce the domain most connected to the instructional methods and practices, the instruction domain. Within this framework, Danielson laid out 5 qualities that we can use to evaluate teaching performance. First, teachers should establish effective communication with students. Teachers should use effective communication to achieve 3 main purposes. 1. To ensure that students understand the goals of learning. 2. To facilitate effective learning activities and transition within activities. And 3. To clearly and correctly explain concepts and strategies. Additionally, good teaching communication should also be diverse in that it includes effective use of both oral and written communication, using language that is vivid, imaginative, and appropriate to the level of the students being taught. Second, teachers should effectively employ questions and discussion techniques to improve both learning outcome and student engagement. To be deemed effective in this quality, teachers should encourage questions of high cognitive challenge formulated by both students and teachers. When possible, use questions with multiple correct answers to encourage multiple approaches and perspectives, even when there is a single correct response. Effectively utilize student responses and ideas to enrich the lesson. Organize discussions among students with the teacher stepping out of the central mediating role. Focus on the reasoning exhibited by students in discussion, both in give and take with the teacher and with their classmates, not just absolute correctness. And finally, encourage high levels of student participation in discussion. Third, teachers should engage students and encourage active participation in learning. This quality mainly deals with the nature of the learning tasks and activities and are evaluated along the below criteria. Allow students to exhibit enthusiasm, interest, deep thinking, problem solving, and etc. Require high-level student thinking and invite students to explain their thinking. Motivate all students to work on all tasks and persist even when the tasks are challenging. Allow all students to actively work rather than watch while their teacher works. Facilitate suitable lesson pacing, neither dragged out nor rushed, with time for closure and student reflection. Fourth, teachers should effectively utilize assessments to inform their instruction. Assessments should not signal the end or beginning of instruction, but an integral part that supports and enriches learning. To be deemed effective in this quality, teachers should pay close attention to evidence of student understanding elicited by assessments, employ specifically created question strategies to elicit evidence of student understanding, circulate to monitor student learning and to offer feedback, and encourage students to assess their own work against established criteria. Lastly, teachers should demonstrate flexibility and responsiveness. As stated above, things in the classroom almost never go as planned. So it is crucial that teachers are ready to respond to changes and adjust their teaching to suit present classroom situations and take advantage of learning opportunities when they arise. To be deemed effective in this quality, teachers should incorporate students' interests and daily events into a lesson, adjust instruction in response to evidence of student learning and understanding or lack of it, and recognize and maximize teaching opportunity to enrich student outcome. Danielson's framework covers various dimensions of instruction, and it has proven useful for teacher evaluation. However, in the context of standards-based instruction, we recommend that a focus should be placed on analyzing how well standards are embedded into our lessons. For this, we will adapt elements from Susan Rockow's description of standards-embedded curriculum, which are most relevant to teaching methods and practices. First, pre-assessments should be employed to cover a broad range of grade level and advanced standards, as well as students' knowledge of surrounding content, such as background experiences with a subject, relevant skills, such as reading and writing, and learning styles or interests. Second, lessons should begin with essential questions, topics, and significant themes. Integrated instructions should be designed around connections among content areas and embeds all relevant standards. Third, enrichment and extensions of learning should be made available to students who are well on their way to achieve standards. They should be provided with ideas, topics, and questions with more depth and complexity, rather than just more challenging practices of isolated skills. Fourth, authentic forms of assessment that evaluate how close students are to achieving required standards should be employed with greater frequency to inform our teaching process. The outcome of such assessment should range from "I learned" to "I can" responses from students. As we have elaborated before, the results of such assessments should be utilized to inform how follow-up activities and subsequent lessons will be differentiated. Now we will look at how we can leverage discussions of instructional methods and practices to improve our teaching performance. In a 2014 report that compiled over 200 peer-reviewed academic papers on teacher evaluation, Durham University identified several areas of focus that teachers should consider when discussing their own or their colleagues' teaching performance. Most importantly, the central point of all such discussion should be on improving student outcomes. This, in essence, is the overarching standard for teachers, one that all educational practitioners should strive toward. Thus, when discussing any factors like instructional methods, teaching practice, teacher behaviors, teacher communication, and many others, we need to always bear in mind the impact that such factors have on student outcomes and strive to adjust our current practices or adopt new ones in order to deliver better results for our students. In the context of standards-based teaching, the concept of outcome is perfectly interchangeable with standard achievement. So it follows that when discussing methods and practice, we need to break down how effective they are at pushing students along on the road to master the required standard competencies, and whether or not we can make any adjustment that can make them more effective in doing so. The next two areas of focus have to do with the kind of feedback that teachers should receive when their teaching performances and activities are discussed. First, feedback should be related to clear, specific, and challenging goals for the recipient. Without a clear, specific, and sufficiently demanding objective, it would be unreasonable to expect the feedback to result in any improvement, since teachers would not know where to move toward. As a matter of fact, this process of constructive feedback to improve teaching performance is very similar to the process of improving student performance in a standards-based framework. The ultimate standard of improving student outcomes could be broken down into smaller strands of increasing student engagement, method selection, method implementation, objective communication, among others, for which the teacher could set clear, specific, and sufficiently demanding goals in order to improve. For example, a teacher struggling with communicating clear lesson objectives to his student could be advised to practice writing lesson objectives and success criteria in ways that clearly link their objectives to a specific competency, and to develop good content checking questions that ensure his lesson objective is clearly communicated with students. Second, when delivered by leaders, feedback should convey a feeling of trust and support. This re-emphasizes what we have earlier discussed in the section about fixing and firing, that it is really important to create a non-threatening environment that fosters growth and development instead of judgment and comparison. In each faculty meeting, there will always be leaders, managers, and other people of senior position, and it is important for them to cultivate a message of support and encouragement, in essence developing a fixing instead of a firing mindset the majority of the time, so that teachers are more comfortable discussing their areas of weakness and what they can do in order to mitigate such weakness. The last area of focus that we would like to discuss with regard to providing post-teaching assessment and feedback about teaching methods and practices for teachers is that of encouraging teachers to continually improve their professional performance. The Durham University report advises that when discussing teacher performance, attention should be on the teaching performance itself, rather than on the teacher or on comparison among teachers. Of course, one of the central purposes of conducting a post-teaching faculty meeting should be for teachers to share their best practices as well as their areas of difficulty and weakness, so that the members of the faculty can learn from each other and improve together. However, the methods and practice themselves should be the focal point of these discussions, and we should avoid giving praise to the teachers with good practices and criticize the teachers with less than ideal practices. Praises and criticisms, when given, should be on the teaching practice themselves and never on the teachers behind them. This goes back to creating a friendly and supporting environment where all teachers are encouraged to explore and improve all aspects of their teachings. In this video, we have discussed issues related to instructional materials, methods, and practices as part of faculty meeting content. On the slides is the list of references we used while developing this training. This is the end of the training video. Thank you for listening.